I'm John Atack. This is my good friend, Dr. Steven Moffic. Hi, Steve.
Hi, John. Hi, everybody.
And yeah, we've just had D-Day and before that, Memorial Day in the US, commemorating the Civil War in the US. And I think that'd be a good place to open. Let's talk about, and let me say before we go any further, my dad was there at D-Day. So
And he
he's
was where?
he was on the beaches in Normandy on
He was
D-Day.
on the beach. Oh,
Yeah.
so you probably got some stories about that.
I would have some stories.
If he told you. Yeah.
My father never talked about his wartime experience. I think it was overwhelmingly horrifying, and he did not want to be reminded. So he was the warrant officer, the regimental sergeant major for the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. So they went in with the tank crews
Wow.
to mend the tanks, and so they were on the front line all the time, and you know, so incredible heroism. I've just watched Band of Brothers, which I didn't watch when it was first shown, but my youngest um, said, "Let's watch this," and it's just, oh, how did these people survive afterwards? The awful things they experienced, but somehow they did, and gave us the world in which we live.
Yeah. What you're saying is very interesting and striking because lots of soldiers who survived apparently had PTSD, but it wasn't talked about. They kept everything to themselves, including in America. It was, and Tom Brokaw did the book about the greatest generation, which is probably true, but um, we didn't examine PTSD very much after that, probably because the war was won
Mm.
and there wasn't the component of moral injury that there was with Vietnam, which
Yeah.
was when PTSD started to get studied. So it's interesting why one war evoked that and the other didn't, even
Mm.
though PTSD was probably about as common after World War II, but without the moral injury. Yeah, I got sort of preoccupied with D-Day just by chance because I turned it on to the news. I wasn't thinking of watching it. This was Thursday. It was also, interesting enough, the first day of Gay Pride
Mm.
weekend here in Milwaukee. So both were happening at the same time. And of course, there's a connection with homosexuality and the Nazis who killed a large number of homosexuals also at the time, let alone gypsies that
Yeah, you
was
had
mentioned.
the Pink Star,
Pink's,
but for
Pink's,
homosexuals who were put into concentration camps. Yes, absolutely.
yeah. And so you mentioned our Memorial Day that happened 2 weeks ago, and it's for fallen soldiers, any soldiers who died in service. And it is actually very poignant for me. I did serve in our Army for 2 years as a psychiatrist, but
Mm.
it wasn't during wartime, although it was interesting. This was 1975. Yeah, 1975. I owed the Army 2 years. I got into this program. So that's a longish story, but I owed the Army 2 years. And I was sent to a base in Alabama, which sounded like a foreign country to me. Never been there before. Deep South. Anyways, the first thing the commanding officer said to all his physicians is, "We have to prepare you for war." This was after the Vietnam War,
Yeah,
right after it. And he said,
immediately
"There's going
after.
to
Yeah.
be another one, inevitably, and you need to know how to help out when we have that." So, and of course, there have been, but every war since then, the United States has not won. So we don't have a good track record. But so, when D-Day came around, um, I thought it was a necessary and beautiful ceremony. It's sort of, in a way, celebrating those who gave their life and
Mm.
the heroism of getting on the beach, either by boat or parachutes or whatever, got people there, knowing, I'm sure most of them knew their chance of dying was really high. And I think of the Americans who came on, it was probably half of those who landed, maybe more. And the paratroopers, all great. So this was 1944, June 6th.
Six, yeah.
Well, what disturbed me as a psychiatrist about all that is, what about those last 5 years? Um, why did it take so long to try a landing at Normandy or anything, at least from the standpoint of the United States?
Mm.
Um, there was strong opposition to entering the war, but how many people potentially could have been their life saved if we would have joined the Allies earlier,
Mm.
well earlier? Why did we wait until it was almost too late? And I think that's so crucial to keep in mind, because how do we know in this situation or others when the risk is so high that we have to intervene?
Mm.
Because if we don't, things are liable to be worse. And that's happening, as I can tell, in Ukraine. It's happening in Gaza.
Yeah.
And it usually happens in wars. It probably happens in cults. People give signals that they're vulnerable,
Mm.
but there's no intervention, and then they're trapped. And so this assessing of early danger was on my mind, and what was disturbing, because I think we should have intervened, could have saved certainly scores of Jewish lives at the time. And in my mind, at the latest, 1942, 1943 should have been when the United States intervened. But, here it wasn't. And the war just lasted one more year after that, but so much damage was already done.
Mm.
So that got me sort of preoccupied. And in a way, I felt uncomfortable honing in on the delay when this was such a glorious, quotes, success story.
Mm.
But it was in one way, but it wasn't in another way.
Yeah, the sacrifice involved was just unbelievable, and
Yeah.
and we sort of, I mean, it's attributed to Stalin, but I'm told he didn't say it. That one death is a tragedy and a million deaths is a statistic. If you look back, you mentioned Memorial Day. I've been reading about what is called Reconstruction,
Mm.
presidential reconstruction after the Civil War in the US. And it's a dreadful story. The whole story of that war, such an avoidable war in which 620,000 Americans perished. If you take the next century after that,
Yeah.
less Americans perished in combat than during that
Yeah.
5-year period. So, and it left. We talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, before that, it had been battle fatigue or combat fatigue
Yeah.
in World War II. Before
Yeah.
that, in World War I, it was shell shock. And it was as
Oh,
if nobody noticed how traumatized people can be. And
yeah.
they didn't put together, often the people who were exhibiting symptoms of PTSD were people who'd won medals for gallantry. They were not cowards. And in the First World War, the treatment for PTSD was to shoot people.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of that happened in World War I. A lot of soldiers were shot for malingering or cowardice, when in
Cowardice.
fact,
That's right.
yeah, they had
Yeah.
a
And
perfectly
speaking of
natural.
just a tidbit about awards that you just mentioned, awards. In the United States, you still can't get a Purple Heart. That's for the most
Mm.
heroism in any war. You can't get it if you have PTSD, because there's not overt physical damage.
Yeah,
It's
it's got to be a physical wound. Yeah,
just incredible. Yeah.
yeah, and so and that consequence of war that you leave so many casualties. Um, and as you say, with World War II, when was the time to intervene? And I'm not going to dwell on this because I have done too often before, but I think that Neville Chamberlain was right. I think he was right at every point, that when he rearmed Britain in 1935 as Chancellor of the Exchequer, so it was him that did it, when he insisted that it be fighter aircraft, the money go on, so that by the time of the Battle of Britain in September 1940, Britain was producing more fighter planes than Germany was. If Churchill's advice to build bombers had been followed, well, we'd be speaking German now. It's that simple. But if Britain had not jumped into the war on this, sense of rah rah and
Yeah.
chauvinism, and kind of gone, well, hang on a minute, the Russians are invading Poland from the north. So why are we
Yeah.
only attacking the Germans? And why are we making any alliance with the Russians? So
Yeah.
it was badly thought through. And when Hitler offered peace after Dunkirk or during Dunkirk, Churchill famously said that you don't negotiate with a lion when your head is in its mouth. And I do appreciate that. But if he'd taken what Hitler offered, which was you can take all 340,000 of your troops home and walk away, what a great offer. And Churchill went, no, we're not going to do that. And so 40,000 lives were lost at Dunkirk. And it took all that time to mount a resistance, during which, of course, Britain, by opting into Lend-Lease with Roosevelt, bankrupted the whole British Empire to fight this war to stop Hitler. And then, of course, after the war, there was tremendous generosity from America, $4 billion. But because we had a socialist government, it was only $4 billion. So Germany and Italy were rebuilt on American money, and Britain wasn't. So a catastrophe politically, but also militarily. As you say, D-Day was not brilliantly thought through. The Italian invasions had been awful. The British army was abandoned in Greece because Churchill had decided to go there despite Roosevelt telling him not to. So, and then we had Arnhem, we had Dieppe before that, these terrible, terrible things, which are all smoothed over in our celebrations of victory, that, and I think I've talked about this before. I'm not sure if I mentioned it to you, that when the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg came along in 1913, it was decided they would bring the veterans together, and more than 50,000 veterans had their expenses paid from all over the US to meet at Gettysburg. Woodrow Wilson addressed them, and more than 50,000. The fascinating point is that of the, I think, 160,000 black soldiers who served for the North, not one of them was invited. So 50 years after Gettysburg, and indeed, of course, 50 years after the amendment that liberated the slaves, they still were not represented in any way at that meeting. And it was a meeting where the blues and the grays got together, and they could shake hands over the wall at Gettysburg and put bygones behind them. And not very much had changed as a consequence of that horrific loss of life. And the echoes of that are still with us today when people show the Confederate battle flag without necessarily realizing that there are ramifications to that image.
Yeah, that's still part of our divisiveness in the United States. And yeah, you're mentioning the aftermath is just as important as the prequel to war. How is the aftermath handled? Because it could lead to ongoing issues as far as trauma goes. There's intergenerational transmission of trauma, which is common, and you get these surprising good results afterwards, and then some of the bad ones you just mentioned. I mean, speaking of Germany, yeah, United States helped it to recover. Astounding to me is that they developed a good relationship with Israel. Jews have moved back to Germany, are so far well protected despite the rise of anti-Semitism. Who would have thought that that could happen afterwards? And so, some good results. I mean, there's ways to make this work, but it takes kind of deeper thought and planning than typically seems to happen, so, and who knows, the prequel and the whatever the aftermath are going to be in Ukraine and Gaza. Ukraine's invasion could have easily been prevented, seems like to me, and also they could be helped more now. And in a way, the same thing is true of Israel and Hamas, that this war did not have to develop the way it did. And we'll see what the aftermath is, but it's, 8 months and going right now, and so many deaths. So
after the Iraq War, one of the local leaders, religious leaders, an imam or a mullah, I'm not really sure which one it would be, put forward the idea that the war had been a bad idea, but now that the Allies had arrived, they would have to stay for at least 2 generations to settle things out, 60 years. And I think, we have seen the consequence, the rise of Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, um,
Yeah.
which it's just like a blot on the map to most of us because we don't live there. But they took the whole way that was done, that the Republican Army, the Iraqi Republican Army, were just thrown out, and they formed the core. That's why ISIL was so powerful, because they had professional soldiers who, of course,
Yeah.
had been trained by Britain
Yeah.
and France.
Yeah.
Let's get into the
And a
deep
bad
stuff on this.
fire. Yeah.
And so, yeah, that the whole, after the Good Friday Agreement, where the Irish Republican Army laid down their arms, and there was, something a lot closer to peace than there had been. There are still incidents there; they're not necessarily reported, but Tony Blair, the then Prime Minister, who would foment the war in Iraq, said, in the end, you have to talk with these people. And I
Mhm.
think he then, of course, helped to invade Iraq, leading to 3/4 of a million casualties, and Afghanistan 150,000. But nonetheless, he did have a good point. In the end, you have to talk to people, and the the what is the benefit of war unless you completely annihilate your enemy?
Yeah,
Then,
which is almost impossible. Yeah.
yeah,
And
thankfully, I mean, the Germans did try it with the Romanists and the Jews and homosexuals, and you know, but unless you annihilate your opponent, then the resentment will carry on generation by generation.
right.
Um,
I mean, I think the biggest instigator to that is when people feel humiliated. And
yes,
then you're out for revenge. You mentioned talking, and of course that leads me to think about psychiatry, because that's what we do. We talk. And
yeah,
uh, there's been some interesting movement on the part of organized psychiatry in the United States. I don't know about in Great Britain, but at the last meeting of the American Psychiatric Association a little over a month ago, there was, for the first time in years and years, a movement to try to form some sort of sub-organization. We call it a caucus about peace and psychiatry. Um, Now, whether psychiatrists can actually do anything to help peace and prevent war is a whole other question. But I also have a colleague who's involved on kind of a unique quest that might have something to do with helping to get and maintain peace. Um, his name is Neil Aggarwal, Aggarwal, and he's one of the authors of a new book called Covert, The Psychology of War and Peace. It's only
mm,
come out in hard copy in India, selling like hotcakes, more than Salman Rushdie's book. Um,
wow,
and at the essence of this book is an interesting strategy. He says he doesn't know whether it can be applied in any widespread practical way, but it's called Track Two negotiations. Track One is between government representatives like in India and Pakistan, which is his focus. It would be governmental people on both sides talking about their relationship to other countries. Well, his idea was to try to educate people who have worked for the government, who might still have contacts, train them in psychiatry and psychology so they understand what's going on. And he's done this with the two co-authors, one of them a spy, former spy from India, the other a former spy from Pakistan. And it was a process that's worked out apparently really well. It's unclear whether it's helped tensions in India and Pakistan, but I thought it was quite a unique idea about how to get psychiatry more involved. And so just one of his simple tenets is if you've had great losses as a country in a war or with a pandemic, if you will, you need to grieve adequately what happened before you can move on and change and develop and learn. If you don't grieve, then everything gets stuck. And
mm,
but he had those two people give their life histories, so they got to know each other better, and they ended up trusting each other. They were more or less bitter enemies in the past. So, so maybe that's something that will develop. He took some of his ideas from a psychiatrist named Vamik Volkan, Volkan, and probably his best. He's written many books. Probably his best is Enemies on the Couch. And so he's in his 90s now. But for many years, he actually traveled around to different countries trying to do something similar, to teach them about how psychiatry could help the government understand what was going on and prevent violence and conflict, and great ideas. Again, we don't know how well practical applications could work, but he sort of paved the way. So psychiatrists are finally getting concerned about this, and we'll see how much we can help.
Yeah, it's a very important point to take up, and that a professional body, they're actually trained in understanding the human mind, could actually bring something to the
I would think so.
dialogue. Yeah. I mean, the Truth and Reconciliation movement, I was very disappointed by what happened in South Africa as a consequence of that. I was out there in '96, so I got a taste of that remarkable set of cultures, interactive cultures. But it didn't lead to reconciliation. However, the program was trialed in Northern Ireland, and the reports we had from that, which was largely about women saying, we've had enough of this. We don't want to do this anymore. I saw a very poignant interview with a woman who had been in the Provisional Irish Republican Army. And she had witnessed a scene where a special policeman, that is a volunteer policeman, had been captured by the Provisionals. And he was strapped into the driving seat of a vehicle that was loaded with explosives, and they set the car going and it blew up. And this woman left the IRA that night. She went, how could we do such horrific and brutal things? And she was quite properly traumatized by it.
Yeah.
A year or two later, she finds herself in a meeting with the wife of this policeman. Mm. And the point where they embrace is the point where something happens. There's a Zen story that a samurai asks a Zen master, what are heaven and hell? And the Zen master says something like, you're an ugly looking fellow. And the guy starts drawing his sword, and he says, here open the gates of hell. The samurai puts his sword back. He says, and here open the gates of heaven. And that thing of being able to reconcile, being able to see the other not as an alien, not as an animal, not as vermin, but as a fellow human being.
Yeah,
and not exactly. We in contemporary culture, we've got all of this stuff that if you don't like somebody, you call them a narcissist or a sociopath or a psychopath, rather than just saying, I think they're being a bit selfish. People are characterized in psychiatric ways which are tremendously inaccurate.
Yeah. Well, at least using those terms are better than vermin and so forth, because they're human terms.
But it's come to be, they've come to be euphemisms for those genocidal terms. When you say somebody's a narcissist, then you don't have to care about their rights or feelings anymore, because they're just, well, vermin, or worse yet, they're predators that have got to be. And sometimes, of course, such people do need to be restrained. It's a good idea. But
well, the strange thing, you probably know this, is that in the United States, psychiatrists, due to the so-called Goldwater rule, are not supposed to discuss or provide any psychiatric opinion that relates to a given individual in the public sphere, meaning politicians.
Yes.
And it's actually stronger than it ever was, but it sort of precludes us from a lot of commenting about what's going on in politics. What we can do is sort of what you were alluding to. We could talk about principles like what's narcissism mean and when should it be used publicly and not, but there's lots we can't talk about. So it limits, what we can do. I also have two other associations to what you said. One is from prison. I worked in a men's prison, medium security, at the end of my career part-time. And Truth and Reconciliation was actually done in the prison with the prisoners and any families that would be willing to talk to one another. And it did seem to work for both sides, you know, to get out some forgiveness and understanding. And I too was in South Africa. This is more kind of a personal thing of our own mutual interest. I went to a conference in 2012 and was asked to speak on the role of jazz in ending apartheid. And so who I talked about was this jazz musician. Originally, his name was Dollar Brand. He became a Muslim,
Abdullah
and it
Ibrahim.
was Abdullah Ibrahim. And his music actually was used by the blacks fighting apartheid. He was actually in the United States or wherever. He couldn't get back into South Africa, but it was just extraordinary, beautiful, uplifting music, and seemed to really, you know, have a role there. And part of the presentation, we played a recording of Hugh Masekela singing about Mandela. And it's this rhythmic song, and all of a sudden the whole audience gets up and starts dancing. We open the door and see probably all of the hotel workers out in the hall listening and dancing. It was like the music was hit them so positively. It was, you know, maybe one of the most lovely experience I ever had presenting anything. And my wife sang part of the song, and it was just quite an experience. But, you know, I thought Truth and Reconciliation there worked pretty well for developing some forgiveness on both sides, but it was an utter failure about economics and the economic future. And that's, I think, what we're still seeing now. I mean, the government hasn't been able to develop the country in a way that's economically good for the whole Black population. So I think that's where it missed its mark. But
yeah, I agree. And the boundaries were set a little too wide, so that what was happening was that the people who had committed horrible crimes, dreadful crimes, were standing up and talking about their crimes with the guarantee that they had immunity. And something similar happened in Northern Ireland when Tony Blair decided that he would release all of those who were in prison for terrorist acts. And I think that was a very strange decision, because it meant that people who had murdered large numbers of people were set free. And I think interfering with the judicial process in that way.
That's it. I mean, it's collating forgiveness with justice, and they're two different things. And if you just do one without the other, you're missing something important.
And the resentment will persist. Also, I mean, the thing that interests me one of the things that interests me in the Russia-Ukraine situation is the way that people are so polarized, that most of the people I know are absolutely pro-Ukraine and absolutely anti-Russia. Now, my opposition is generally towards the governments of countries, not towards the poor people who are forced into the front line. And it became a significant matter to me that there's an umbrella group funded by the European Council, an adjunct of the European Parliament, called FECRIS. I've spoken at a couple of their conferences, one in Copenhagen, one in Riga, and they're meant to be an umbrella group for groups that are providing information about authoritarian cult groups. And they declared suddenly, a couple of years back, I think it must have been, that a friend of mine, Professor Alexander Dvorkin, who'd been on their board and had a great deal to do with organizing their conferences, was now no longer a member. And the only reason they seemed to be giving, and I did protest this, was that he was Russian. And the fact that he lived in Moscow and worked as a professor of medieval history in Moscow was enough to say, well, no, he's now a bad person. And it was like, this is the very polarization and factionalism that I object to that occurs in authoritarian cult groups.
Yeah.
And it, what Putin decides to do doesn't color my opinion of my friend Sasha in any way. He's I've known this guy since 1993. He's a wonderful man. So this idea that you suddenly declare, all Ukrainians are good, all Russians are bad. Let's get into the simplicity here. And what's happened in Ukraine is so much more complicated than that. As you say, the right of the Ukrainians to be an independent country is paramount. That's I believe in that right wherever we go. I also believe that the Basques in France and Spain should have independence, because the majority of when you get over a quarter of a million people living somewhere and they say, we want to become the country of Andorra or Monte Carlo or Liechtenstein or what have you, I think that's a right. And
Yeah.
so it bothers, Catalonia in Spain as well. I think they have the right to be independent. Ukraine has that right. Georgia has that right. They've, were attacked in 2008 by the Russians and are currently very worried about infiltration from the Russians, which is leading to a terrible upswing of populism in Georgia, and neo-Nazism even.
Yeah.
So to try and understand what's really happening and to try and not engage ourselves emotionally, to try and not take a side and understand that these are human beings we're dealing with. Some of them are nasty on both sides. Most of them are good on both sides. What can we do to calm things down and make things work better?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we have human nature involved in all these places. I mean, our basics, human nature is similar. And so I can take what's happening between Ukraine and Russia just to talk about Democrats and Republicans in the United States. It's like, they won't, neither side will talk to the other because they think the other side's wrong, and they aren't and there are ways to talk to each other, which is respectful, curious, compassionate, not critical. But this, people have a tendency to divide because of probably some basic fear of the other and scapegoating them to get your own power and so forth. So we see this happening everywhere. And yeah, I think establishing nations of people who are quite similar is good in one sense. But I think if that goes without some important identification with the whole world, then we're in perennial trouble.
But we are in perennial trouble.
Yes. And so it's like, and then nowadays, this trouble has potentially worse outcomes because we have so much better ways to kill ourselves. So how are we going to develop more, global identifications? We have these organizations that are supposed to try to help with that, but they don't seem all that successful either. So I think it's sort of a dilemma. And, of course, if you go back to United States history, you're talking about the Civil War. I mean, the South wanted to have their own country. What would happen if they had their own country? That's very hard to project. But I think it has worked out well over time to have the unification, even though we still have remnants of the divisiveness going on. But I think the results of kind of forcing the two sides to continue together worked out reasonably well. So very tricky, but we're dealing with our human nature, and our human nature doesn't change very much, very slowly, if at all. And I think that's kind of again an underlying area where psychiatry might be useful.
Absolutely, and I'm hopeful that unlike most of the people I know in this world of climageddon, as a friend of mine calls it, I'm hopeful because I think human nature can be changed very rapidly. And I think the Truth and Reconciliation program is an example of that, where it worked. That realizing, if one day you realize, the Dalai Lama, for whom I don't have a tremendous amount of respect, because of some of his associations with dangerous people.
Mm,
But
mm,
putting that aside, I do have respect for some of the ideas he's put forward. And one of them, given that he is the king of a people and the 14th incarnation of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, we're told. But he's, since he was 4 years old and was discovered to be the Tulku
yeah,
of the Dalai Lama, he's lived a very special life.
yeah.
And one day he said, I've realized I'm just the same as everyone else.
Mm,
And I think, that revelation that when we cross the gap and say, these are people, they have appetites, they get hungry, they get cold, they get tired, they become emotionally distressed. They have the same problems that I have. And reaching across that false barrier, which is nation, which is the identification with an abstraction that doesn't actually exist.
mm-hmm,
A friend of mine a few years ago was telling me that he was patriotic. And he was also telling me, he was a Trump supporter, he was telling me that he wanted to build a wall. And I pointed out to him that he was an immigrant to the United States.
mm-hmm.
And did he realize that patriotism meant the willingness to die for Democrats, not just for Republicans? That it, and we start representing ourselves as, well, I'm British, or, well, I'm English. Well, actually, I'm from the Midlands in England. Well, actually, I come from Staffordshire. Well, actually, my street is the best street. Actually, my house is that. Where do we draw these lines, and what is the sense of national identity on Memorial Day, Decoration Day as it was originally, on D-Day? It's people now, as it became fairly rapidly, within 10 years after the Civil War, the blues and the greys were getting together to say, that's over. And you had the Lost Cause faction with the Confederates and the Bloody Shirt faction with the Union still, who were both saying, no, we need to be a part. And we still have the echo of, particularly, of the Lost Cause movement. But
Yeah,
to say, what my grandfather did to your grandfather is not tremendously relevant. What we need to do is, to all of us right now, believe in equalism,
yeah,
get rid of these gender problems, get rid of these race problems, get rid of these stupid effects of history, and say, now we are all equal. I'm not responsible for the past any more than you are. I'm not responsible for anything I didn't do, or anything I didn't support. Let's go forward, in a positive way. And
yeah,
psychiatry, maybe this is the beginning of something quite new, this social psychiatry, and the idea of saying, well, how can we do something positive for humanity, knowing what we do about such things as mass sociogenic illness, the way
yeah,
that people will just go crazy together,
yeah. Well, yeah, and what you said about cognitive processes could help change human nature. I think that's definitely true. I mean, it's sort of the basis of most all of psychotherapy. It works, and the tricky part of it is it can be temporary, but we know it can work. So that's the positive part. As long as we build sort of structures like truth and reconciliation, I think where forgiveness is so important, even if you weren't involved in what happened before, that at least from your perspective, you're willing to forgive, quotes, the other side. So I think that's really important. The other way we know it's changeable is from the psychedelics, because they produce certain chemical brain changes, and people's attitude about others change, usually for the better. Now, you can't give everybody the right dose of a psychedelic, but the point is, it also shows that human nature is changeable, amenable, depending on what helps us change our brain chemistry. And that could be done cognitively, it could be done through psychedelics, and there's probably going to be other ways. Certainly, child rearing has a tremendous effect on how people turn out. So,
Oh yeah.
so yeah, there's ways to overcome our limitations from human nature.
And we can think, we can change our minds.
Yeah,
We have, that part of evolution that is cultural transmission, where we
yeah,
learn from our mistakes and behave in a better way.
Yeah,
And
I always thought that with our sense of identification, like if I call myself Jewish American or American Jew, it needs to have something else attached to it, like Jewish American Earthling, um,
yes.
something to remind me and everybody that we're also part of a much bigger identification with other people,
Mm.
not just where we live or our ethnic background or our religious background. We need something wider. So
I think
more.
that's a very, very good point indeed. That and earthling's quite a good word for it. That, I tend to go, I'm a human being, and I watched the tendency to include the past of my nation as that's an us. So we in Britain did this at D-Day, and it's so, well, I wasn't there, and what has happened in the past belongs to the past, and it belongs to all of humanity. So where something positive happens for humanity, that's something that we should be sharing. And
Yeah,
if we look at religion, where religion has done positive things, which all of the major religions have, there have been tremendous positive achievements. And when you look at the idea in Christianity, or indeed more originally in Buddhism and also in Judaism, of the Golden Rule, the idea that you should be treating other people the way you want to be treated, no matter who they are, no matter,
that's tricky. That's
yeah,
tricky
isn't it?
though. I mean, that's basically the golden rule, right?
Yeah.
But when you say, and everybody, not everybody, it's such a popular rule, but when
Mm.
you say you want to treat others the way you would like to be treated, what if your things that you want for yourself is different than what the other person wants? And so, we have this platinum rule, which is less well known, which is to do unto others um, what they would like you to do for them. In other words, to support their cultural values
Mm.
rather than your own. Actually, I think both rules are needed, kind of a combination. But I think the golden rule, we used the term narcissistic before. I think it's a narcissistic rule. It's like, okay, we'll treat you the way we want to be treated, whether you like that way or not. It sounds good, but
Well,
it,
yeah, and the platinum rule is better because it means I don't have to force the pistachio ice cream on other people, and there'd be more of it for me, and I like it. So giving
yeah,
people what they actually want is, but yeah, being as kind to other people as you would like them to be to you, you know, and making sure that I have enough pistachio ice cream, obviously, as an
yeah,
adjunct
that
to this.
kindness is crucial. Yeah,
Mm.
it's just yeah,
Fantastic. Well, I this has been great fun, and it always is. And for once, I occasionally allowed you to talk.
no, you always do, but I like hearing what you say because I learned so much from
Well, I was kind.
when you go into stuff in depth. So no,
I
I
was
love it.
kind.
I don't know about the audience, but I love it.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's the main thing. I mean, we should please ourselves. Let's get to this.
or both, like we're talking about, kind of both sides. Please ourselves and please the audience at the same time. So
Hmm.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, that's a really interesting point. I have this tiny little channel with 9,000 or something subscribers, and you know, if we're lucky, 1,000 people will watch this. And it isn't it a strange relationship to think these wonderful people out there who bother to give us the time of day and find what we have to say interesting. And then I look at what else is happening on the internet and oh no, sort of
yeah,
nonsense that
yeah.
still that's human nature.
Yeah, potential for good and bad. It's right.
Yeah.
It's right there.
Yeah.
Um, and it's true of all the things we invent. It can be used for good or not.
Yeah. So often the case that where something should be used for good and it's not. So
Mm.
when Leonardo da Vinci made the huge, huge clay horse, which stood for years in Milan, it was he was going to take a mold from it and cast it in bronze. But just at that point, the French invaded, and the Sforza family in Milan said, "Oh, all of this material, this metal you've gathered, and this brilliant new bronze casting, let's make cannons from it. So there's the most direct, and the horse sadly was never cast.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that story. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Incredible man. Well, it's been great fun. Dr. Steven Moffic and myself, John Azat, we thank you deeply for your time and attention. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you, John, and audience for watching and listening.
Yes.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.